Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is my new friend Joe Szimhart, whose wonderful book you should all rush out and buy immediately. Um, and today we're going to talk about what are we going to talk about today, Joe? What do you think?
Well, the main theme that brought us together is this topic of cults and why they form and how they affect people, and whether they're good or bad, and when they are good and bad. And so maybe we'll circle around that drain and see if we can go down the rabbit hole and find something.
Drains and rabbit holes, all in one metaphor.
Yes.
And you say something that I agree with, just in passing there, which is whether cults are good or bad. That all of this argument about, we mustn't use the word cult because it's pejorative, and a cult is just a group that is devoted to a particular set of principles or a person, and they can be very good. They can be very helpful. The cult of medicine and people who decide they're going to wash their hands before performing surgery. That's just an idea that people follow. But our work, our lives have been largely dedicated towards destructive or dangerous cults, which imprison their members in an ideology, which becomes a kind of psychological enslavement. And the question is, as you say, how do these groups form? Why do they form? And how better can we understand those processes? So do you want to kick off with something there?
I think that's what the main discussion is about. And I think in terms of former members, when they enter that stage of recovery, trying to sort out what happened to them, like I did and you did, the process of what they may have been searching for all along in the destructive cult, whether it's Eastern-based or Christian or whatever, that process of self-realization and self-meaning, then that process really begins in earnest in the recovery process. Once you realize you've been wounded, now who am I? Now where am I going? Now what have I done? Kind of questions come up. And what have they done to me? That's the other question. How was I influenced? This influence game.
And often the simplistic question, why was I so stupid? Why did I fall for it? And the answer to that is a lot more complicated than it seems, and has nothing to do with stupidity, in my experience.
No, it doesn't. But I found it in my own search for that answer. The first paper I wrote after leaving this group, Church Universal and Triumphant, was sometime in 1981, and it was called Confessions of a Spiritual Idiot. So the recognition, the complete recognition that I'm taking a lot of the blame for this. I'm not blaming the group.
Yeah,
I think was a healthy start for me, and because it forced me to face my own anger. And my own confusion at what I had gotten into, and it started this deconstruction, reconstruction process that led to maybe what I am today. But this has been going on and still goes on.
Me too.
But I think that's the healthy thing, is to recognize, to name the problem, and one is that the problem is partly you, or maybe wholly you, that you made this choice. And if you can take responsibility or some responsibility for it, I think it allows you agency and to overcome it. Whereas if you blame the group, or you blame everything on your spouse after a divorce or whatever, you don't really get to the agency of, well, what could have I done better? Why did I make that choice to begin with, even though it was bad? Why did I think it was good? All those questions can come up if you own the agency. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
And it is very important, no matter the circumstance. And we have to also accept that accepting victimhood can also be important, to accept that things were done to you that were beyond your control, that you were forced into. So, for example, somebody who was, you're a woman who was in the Children of God and went out doing flirty fishing, recruiting through prostitution. There was a quite elaborate psychological process to persuade them to do that. My friend, you probably know Dieter Roman too.
Yes.
He spent 6 months talking women into doing this decades ago, and has had an astonishing, a remarkable career as a psychologist, helping people since, and he's a person I respect and admire. But that there's also, I don't have any sense of victimhood. I walked into Scientology. I never became a total convert. I did most of it, and then I walked away. And I couldn't understand why people were so caught up in the ideas, and it was so hard for them to escape, because, while it took me a long time to figure out where the ideas came from and what they were, to put them down for me was a matter of a day. It was just saying, I don't believe any of this anymore, because I'll think about it, as a Scientologist thinking about it, and I need to get outside of it, and then I'll readopt anything that's sensible. And here we are 37 years later, and I haven't actually readopted anything, because anything that's good in it I've found better explanations of from the sources that Hubbard pirated in the first place. But that balance of understanding that things were done to you and it's not your fault that those things were done to you, that can be important. But I think what you're saying is the most important thing, which is, how did I get there? Even if somebody stood on my toe, why did I put my foot there in the first place, seeing that this person had got such big feet? Why did I dance with them anyway?
And I also think it brings up a whole lot of other questions, because we live in kind of a mysterious world. There's things that happen that go woo in the night and boo in the dark, and we can't quite figure them out. And of course, we have incredible symbol systems set up to help us cope with that. And they could be anything from, Harry Potter novels to elaborate religions, like Tibetan Buddhism or Catholicism or whatever, to help us cope with it.
Or in science, where we have dark matter, dark energy, superstrings, all sorts of notions, which when you get to them, go woo in the night. That there is not a clear-cut rule book here about how life, the universe, and everything works.
It's not about being clear-cut. It's about being a believer in the process. So if you become kind of a mystic atheist, like some people think they are, they adopt a form of Buddhism and then that's it. But there's still this enriching symbol system within science that informs them, which doesn't have a lot of answers, but has a hell of a lot of symbols in it, from string theory to quantum mechanics. I mean, it works almost at a symbolic level, and then somehow it becomes real when it's put into an experimental device like a bomb or a nuclear furnace, So we do make that work, but it's all in numbers and mathematics and physics. It's a symbol world. And some of these symbol worlds, we have no way of like string theory, we have no way of putting it into practice, so to speak. There's no cogent way of making it work. But it's an interesting theory, so it's almost religious in a sense.
Yeah, it's a belief system.
It's a belief system, but yet it's supported with quite a bit of interesting rational things like mathematics and physics and all of that. So I think that we do tend to live in a lot of mysterious engagements anyway, and I think that's what's so easy for a cult leader or someone that comes up with a hero system, a heroic cosmology on their own, like Hubbard did, to invite people into, because it seems like this guy seems like he knows what he's doing. He's very confident, or he's very pompous, or whatever you want to term it. And as a result, we want to share in that confidence and get caught up in this new symbol world, which,
just looking at Nazi Germany and seeing that 45% or something of doctors, medical doctors, joined the Nazi Party because of that certainty that was being broadcast. And given history and the rear view mirror, we can see that the certainty that was being broadcast was just Hitler's madness, and the madness of the group around him, that they were not scientists who'd cracked a puzzle and could now engineer the future. They were people who'd misunderstood Darwin severely and were set on creating the master race.
Yeah, I guess the big lesson in all of this, at least for me, has been that every single one of our symbol systems is flawed and therefore can be questioned.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you don't want to create a new symbol system, totalist system out of cynicism, because that then becomes another problem. So
neoconservatism, for example, yeah.
Or that, yeah. So the ability to remain somewhat flexible, have a sense of humor, and agree that you could be wrong about something is very important, I think, in this quest, and that spark of humility, which comes with humor.
I agree completely. Completely. You have to have compassion. We have to have humility, and anything that doesn't have humor and self-deprecation involved in it is potentially dangerous. The one thing that cult leaders will not stand is any kind of joking and degrading, as Ron Hubbard called it.
Right. To mock the leader is considered a blasphemy.
Absolutely, and
but
will be punished for it.
In healthy court systems, they've had court jesters for a reason.
Yeah,
and they had a very important function if they were good at it. And the king and the queen knew that they were just human beings with their own private problems in their private quarters, functioning symbolically on their thrones. And if they saw that for what it was, then the jester would be fun to have around. And so, but then you could tell the jester, okay, it's time to go away. We're going to assume our role right now, and we're going to make rules and laws, and if you don't follow them, off with your head. But the idea of having that comic relief, I think, is so necessary, and it's lacking. One of the things that's lacking in a destructive cult, I find more often than not, is that comic relief.
Yeah.
I mean, people like to make fun of themselves within the group, but there's a very strict limit to it as to how far you can go with that, as far as the leader's behavior and letting him know that you're making fun of him.
And you ridicule outside targets. So with Scientology, it's psychiatrists, anybody, psychologists, psychotherapists. I remember going to a Christadelphian meeting when I was about 17, and I didn't realize that the friend who was taking me there was seriously interested in joining them. I thought we were going along because it'd be amusing. So I had totally the wrong perspective. And somebody talked about Darwin and monkeys, and the whole room erupted into laughter. And it was just like, well, yes, it's this in-group, out-group thing of, that's funny. And there's that difference between gentle good humor and out-and-out sarcasm. And many groups mistake ridicule for humor.
Yes.
And, we do need satire in our society. We absolutely need it, especially at the moment with our politicians. But to be that scathing humor about the other, about the outside world, which just makes a barrier between ourselves and the rest of humanity, that has no virtue. But being able to laugh about, being able to see the limitations of your own thinking is kind of helpful. And the older I get, the more I think I ought to get some humility. I'm going to try it soon.
Yeah, I think that these shows like Saturday Night Live in the U.S. do a pretty good job of satire. Sometimes they bleed over into ridicule, which is cruel, but it's a hard line to not cross when you're doing humor.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, Spitting Image has finally, after many years, returned in the last few weeks, and they have some great stuff about Trump and Boris Johnson and what have you. And I always loved the way they did things, although they did actually ruin the careers of several politicians back in the the 80s. But some of them, like David Steele here, who were relatively decent. But nonetheless, that satire of leaders, I think, having the court jester, having somebody always pushing and opposing what they're saying and undermining them, saying they're human. They're not gods descended to earth, which is the tradition of all religions, from Babylon to now, this idea that the king is has the divine right from from God, the gods to rule us. And that often our systems, as Joseph Campbell pointed out so frequently, our systems work that way as pyramid hierarchies, where the person at the top, the president or whoever, is seen as, having these supernatural properties. JFK's Camelot and the critique of groupthink there over the Bay of Pigs is a good example of that functioning. And again, as you say, with certainty, in an uncertain world, which the more uncertain it gets, the more even very smart people will cleave to somebody who says, I've got the answer, without necessarily understanding that that answer will mean concentration camps or something of that type.
Yeah. I think the idea that we become invested in our own hero systems too much can create a huge problem in our relationships with the general world out there. And unless we have a cult following, people won't like us very much for that kind of behavior. So I think with some people, they need to cultivate the cult following in order to sustain this sense of self-importance that they believe they have. Because without that, they themselves will fall apart, will get unmasked, so to speak, and now they become an object of disdain and like the crazy person on the street. They have no self-esteem now unless they maintain that following. So I think once a cult leader begins to maintain a following, it's important for them to control it, and that's where the abuses come in. Is that as time goes on, the exit costs, as Professor Zablocki used to say, get stronger.
Yeah.
It becomes much more dire and full of threats if you do leave the group. And it could be anything from the threat on your very life or betraying the system, like treason, or leaving the mafia with all the information in your head about what you know. They don't want you around outside the group, right?
You won't be a good fella anymore.
Or you could be cursed to many lifetimes of pain and suffering for not following the path anymore. I don't know, what was the main curse if you left Scientology? Was it that you would never get to the bridge to total freedom, or what was it?
Well, it's sort of, there's a transforming point. About the time I left, they started telling people that they would lose their immortality. And I remember first hearing this after I'd left, somebody saying, but I might lose my immortality. And it's like, how would that happen? And then a plaintive story, which I told the other day, I think, to Ron Miscavige, that this is a story of a woman who had joined the Sea organization and so, worked a 90-hour week for 40 years or something. Then as old age set in and she was no longer useful, she was just thrown out. And she'd done everything in Scientology in that period. So she'd become a superhuman according to their standards. And somebody then came round to her and said, oh, well, unfortunately, until you do superpower, you will, even when you drop your body, when you die, you'll be caught by the implant stations that as yet science has not detected, that circle the earth, and you'll lose everything you've gained. So you have to find, I think it was £35,000 for the package of books, lectures, all of this stuff. And this woman who's just got a state pension somehow manages to go to some terrible moneylender, borrow this money and give it to them. So she's now, all of her pension, she's got no rent money, no food money, nothing. It all goes to them so that she will not lose her immortality. Thankfully, one of her daughters then went to them and said, you give her the money back or else. And they did. They will respond to such pressure. But yeah, this idea that somehow your persistence, and it's like with the Krishnas when you're talking with them and they're sort of, well, we have to chant the mantra because otherwise we won't be able to get a good reincarnation, that we'll become earwigs again and have to go through 80,000 incarnations so that we can walk in the, lay ourselves down in front of the juggernaut and be crushed and join Krishna. What an interesting religion that is. So yeah, in Scientology, simply that. I don't know what I thought when I left, other than I'd always thought that the bridge, there'd come a point where you'd have to jump. It couldn't actually get you all the way over. So I still had this Buddhist notion of, I'd still have to become enlightened. I'd have to do that. And I guess there's, that was just me, and
yeah, it's kind of more the drawbridge of total freedom in Scientology, and they never quite let it down at the other end to get you across.
it's like Eisenstein's
hung up there on this cliff wondering what next, and they tell you, well, that's it.
Yeah, it's like Eisenstein's drawbridge in October, where that incredible scene where the horses are falling down as the drawbridge lifts.
Yes.
And that's pretty much what it felt like leaving.
Interesting. Even a religion like Christianity, which has the ultimate solution to death by just accepting the good news, which is what gospel means. You just accept the good news that God, in the guise of Jesus, has conquered death and has also the power to forgive all your sins instantly, when you're ready to go. And in a sense, that message, the charisma or the gospel, the good news, puts an end run around every Christian cult out there.
Yeah.
You don't need the cult. You don't need the church. You don't need the Pope. You really don't. That's what's so ironic about the entire Christian message is if you really read it and grasp it and take it to heart, that's it. You go and sin no more. You live a good life. Everything else is taken care of. You don't have to go up steps. You don't have to read scripture every day. You don't have to fellowship. It's very interesting to me after all this time, because I was raised Christian Catholic, that I've sort of that sort of hit me very hard in the last 10 years is that this gospel thing is pretty interesting. It's actually dismissing the idea that you need a temple. You don't have to make sacrifices of animals to this God, because the sacrifice is the God. The God does the sacrifice.
Yeah.
You basically eat the God to stay alive, nature, and the God eats you, which is what happens when you look at the cosmos. It kind of eats itself up. The old Ouroboros idea in ancient alchemy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Ouroboros. But anyway, you can. All I'm doing here is speculating to get beyond the pressure of having to join a group. There's ways to do that. You can do that through Buddhism. You can do that through Christianity. You can do that through a lot of philosophies. Epicureanism, Stoicism. There's ways that we have devised as human beings to reduce our anxiety about having to become part of a bigger system. But that's hard for people to do because, I don't know if it takes a lifetime of processing all this to come to that conclusion, because I don't see many young people doing that except maybe out of cynicism and saying, well, I don't need anything like that. And then they end up joining something even worse, in other words, jumping out of the frying pan of their Judaism into the fire of happy, healthy, holy under Yogi Bhajan or something, which I've saw thousands of times.
Stefan Molyneux, or the new internet cults where you can abandon everything sensible in your life at a moment's notice. And the larger cults. I mean, as you know, Margaret Singer, with the title "Cults in Our Midst," that was tongue in cheek because she felt that, as I do, that society is cultic, and the cults of politics are the ones, and the cults of the commercial cults, the corporate cults, which have this gospel of we make money, and it would be against the law for us to do anything other than make money, which of course was also the governing policy of Scientology: make money, make more money, make others produce so as to make even more money. The first three principles. So to be an individual and yet to be able to work within society, to be pro-social. I'm a big fan of Eric Fromm, who spent a lifetime extrapolating these ideas of what it is to be grown up, what it is to be human, and he, again, was somebody who described himself as a mystical atheist. I'm a mystical agnostic. I don't know one or the other, where mysticism means trying to find out what the truth is. and just trying to, no matter what we're told, trying to find out what's true, as opposed to alchemy or magic, which is performing rituals or going through things to try and make, transmute the lead of the soul into gold.
But think about this, even because I've thought about it, even the alchemist that's doing these things that are proto-chemistry with gold and all this stuff, actually uses that much like an artist uses a canvas to reflect on their own internal process. So by doing the external process, but not, in other words, having a sense of humor about it, that it isn't it, but it's me interacting with it. My relationship with this is what's refining me. So as I refine a metal to make it better gold, I'm actually, through the process of interacting with this, becoming enriched by my victory, that I've really created gold. So it doesn't make me gold, but it at least has a kind of a relationship, so I think this is what ritual is all about in its proper context, whether it's in India doing the Agnihotra in the morning to the sun god, and so forth, has its value. And I think Joseph Campbell saw this, and other mythologists saw this, that the actual doing of the thing has some value.
But there is one problem though. Alchemy, the chemistry, is a Sufi idea, and comes into the West from there. The very word, of course, is Arabic. And while if we take it as we perform these rituals and there is purification possible through these rituals and the development, one could even say that the table of elements proves that they're right, that you can transmute one element to another. There is a significant problem, however, with alchemy, which Isaac Newton, who spent more time doing alchemy than anything else, found out. And that is that when you're using base materials like mercury, you can severely poison yourself along the way. And his later madness was probably because of his alchemy. So I agree that the process can be, it can be a useful and helpful process, and understanding that we mature, we develop. But it can also go down all sorts of wrong side routes.
So again, what you're bringing up here is interesting. If you're going to go into a ritualistic path, and I mentioned, I just, before we got on here, I finished this book about Alexandra David Neal called Forbidden Journey, and her incredible life. She was also a very difficult person. And despite all of her quest for enlightenment, that character of hers never really changed. She was still the spoiled brat, manipulating people around her, even at the end of her life, so at age 100. So, despite all the questing in Buddhism and everything else, her character didn't change. But she did point out in there that she submitted at some point to gurus in Tibet, and they had to try to tame her, in other words. She had to follow everything very strictly, because if you're going to go down that path, you need a teacher. Now, there's some common sense to this. If you're going to learn mathematics, unless you're some kind of a genius with innate skills, which probably isn't there anyway, you have to learn something about the structure of it in order to become a genius. So the better teacher you have, the better they can cultivate your qualities as a mathematician. And I think that might transfer to the religious quest as well, that if you want to become a good priest or a good rabbi, it helps to have a teacher that you submit to help you learn the qualities of what that is, what the rules and regulations are, so that then you can go and function as a quality rabbi or a quality priest in your particular community.
Well, one of the stories that comes out of that community is two Tibetan monks meeting a Chinese monk who has gone the incredible arduous journey to get into Tibet because he wants to practice levitation. He's heard of this great levitation master, and he's very disappointed, and he's on his way back to China. And the monks say, well, what happened? And he said, well, when he got there, he was drunk. The levitation master was drunk. And the Tibetan monks looked at him and said, yeah, but could he levitate? And I think there's a fundamental truth in there. That's understanding, does the person have the skills? Because with most of the gurus, they make no demonstration. You get the Sai Babas who use magical tricks, but they don't really demonstrate. And for me, I think the point where I really started to pull away from Scientology was where somebody told me what a severe reality adjustment was. I'd hired this guy who'd worked for Hubbard, and I was running a little artists agency, and my wife hadn't sold anything that week. And so this guy takes her into a tiny little room and screams his head off at her from like 6 inches away, telling her what a destructive, suppressive, awful person is, and how she, and I hovered outside the door because I'd never, I was never involved in the staff in Scientology. I'd never seen this kind of behavior. And I didn't go in and stop him. And it took me, the next time I saw him 3 days later, I said to him, look, where did you learn this technique? I don't know anything in the teachings of Scientology. And of course, Hubbard said, if it isn't written, it isn't true. So if it's not written down, you shouldn't do it. So where is it written that you do this? He said, it's not written anywhere. And then he put his head in his hands and started crying. And he said, Hubbard did it to us. And at that moment I went, because for me, anybody who uses rage as an instrument has something badly wrong with them. And so, my hero image of Hubbard slumped at that moment. Yeah. So, having a very good, careful look at the guru, seeing what people say by using not Google, but DuckDuckGo to find out, because they don't steal your information, to find out what is known, what people have said about this person before jumping in the water and believing that you will be able to swim under the tuition of this person. So,
I think what you're saying, I mean, the safeguards regarding someone's value as a guru or teacher go way back, and there's always systems of checks and balances and testing and all of that, or even in India, the idea of lineage, that you can tell how good a guru is by where he was trained. So if a particular school has a good reputation and this person can prove their lineage from that school, you can trust them a little bit better.
And you get people like Mahesh who claim to have been appointed.
Right, and he wasn't. In fact, he proved it by his behavior. So,
and he tells two completely different stories about the origin. I was commissioned in 1991 to write a book about TM, and I gave up on it because I don't want to be harassed by two groups. And I found out just how nasty they could be. Yeah. But I found these two stories, and it's him telling them. And one is that with the death of his master, who was the Shankaracharya of the North. There's a
something like that, yeah.
Yeah, there's one in the North, one in the South. So one of the great.
Actually, there's 4 of them.
Okay, 4 of them.
Yeah.
So
at least in my reading back in the 1980s, I remember there were supposed to be 4. But anyway,
you've doubled my information in a single moment. Look at that. He studies with one of these guys, and in one story he says, I went north. I was so distressed, when the relationship was over. I went north to the Himalaya, and I meditated, and the teaching came to me, a simple teaching for Westerners. But in another place, in another talk, he says, I went south and I meditated on the shrine of Lakshmi, and the idea came to me. Now, I knew that Lakshmi was the deity of money and wealth, and I thought, that's the true story. But that, they just make stories up, these people that give them this thing. So yeah, you can kind of check if the university they went to really exists, and if their PhD is true. But I mean, Carlos Castaneda, he had a proper PhD, but he was a monster, and made all of that stuff.
Well,
up.
He wasn't a proper PhD. He conned the anthropological, he went through the process, but his story about doing real field work was fake.
But
they never sorted that out. Yeah.
Didn't UCLA refuse to rescind his PhD despite being told that? Am I wrong?
I don't recall that.
So if you checked with the university, checked with the university, you'd think he was, it was real. So that's
his books, his early 2 books, got endorsed by people as famous as Mircea Eliade, who was director of the history of religions.
And you don't get any bigger in that field than Mircea Eliade. I agree.
No, and he said it sounded credible,
Yeah. Because he'd read all of Mircea Eliade's books about shamanism. And
well, Eliade's been criticized because he was kind of an armchair researcher, where he was gathered information from all over the place, you know, in order to put shamanism together.
But before that,
Originally.
He did study yoga in the Himalaya.
He did, but he didn't study all those other systems he was talking about. Oh. So in a sense, his book Shamanism became a sensation, but according to Alice Beck Kehoe, another anthropologist, it also destroyed what shamanism truly was in its indigenous places, like in Tibet, Russia, and parts of northwestern United States. And it became more of a global term applying to all kinds of things.
Yeah, I agree that's.
So I mean, Eliade had his flaws, as I'm trying to point out, and this is the process in academia and in science, is to continually refine the gold. It's an alchemical thing, you know, because you find flaws in it. Well, let's boil it down again. You know, let's boil Eliade down again and see what he's got. You know, so you can continue to do that. And you can find that, he had his flaws as well.
Yeah, which is why the analytical, evaluative process of science is valuable. And in history, that's been fascinating, that history used to be the tale as told by the victors and a Mississippi of lies, as Voltaire said. But history in the really since the Second World War, has become, there's scientific history. There are ways of reaching right into the past. My favorite example, and this is a sidetrack, so I'll try to be quick, is King John, Bad King John, the brother of Richard the Lionheart, son of Henry II, who has this terrible reputation. You have the whole Robin Hood story made up, completely made up, and he's this evil, terrible person. In the late 1940s, the pipe rolls were opened, and these were the daily records of the court, and nobody had ever looked at them. And they record day by day what he actually did. And a historian wrote a new book saying, well, actually, the people who wrote the histories about him were Canterbury monks. And his biggest fight was not allowing them to make their own archbishop. And ultimately, he was excommunicated for that. And it's Roger Wendover and Matthew Paris. They make up these stories about him. And the pipe rolls say that he was actually a more diligent king than any king before him. He spent all of his time trying cases for a very low fee compared to what his father had charged. And so this is scientific history. This is the ability to revisit the past and say, well, people used the sources they had. Those sources were wrong. And, you know, archaeology, the archaeology of Israel, for example, where we don't seem to be finding any of the things in the Old Testament, try though we may. You know, the Temple of Solomon
seems to be
mythical.
Right.
And
you know, and we I think that's the difficulty people have, is the discussion between literalism and actuality, and then the symbolic world that these religions put together for us for reasons. You know, you know, for people to believe in a hero, you have to create a hero system around him and or her. I mentioned Alexandra David Neal. She was very invested in carefully crafting what her image was, how her books were to be received. Her private letters she wanted burned about what she was really doing. And so a lot of them leaked out, which this new book has. It's not a new book, it was written in the late 80s, but it was written after her death. But all I'm pointing out here is that she was invested in creating her own hero system. She was very invested in this idea that if she could excite the public, she would be recognized as was wonderful. And she was. I mean, she succeeded to a great extent.
Oh, yeah. And her books are fascinating. I mean, I still recommend her overview of Buddhism as the best one I know. A really simple book about understanding the basic principles of Buddhism. But as Joseph Campbell said, mythology is not history, it's psychology. And everything starts to make sense when you view these stories as, well, Jonah wasn't really swallowed by a whale, you know, but the story is telling you something, and getting into whether it's literally true or not doesn't really matter. Understanding what you're being told by the story, you know, or how you can interpret it. There's Norman Cohen, the great historian who wrote Pursuit of the Millennium, Europe's Inner Demons. He wrote a lovely book called Noah's Flood, and it looks at the 19th century period after people like Charles Lyell had said the world must be a lot older than the 4004 BC that Ussher said, because there are striations of rocks and something else is happening. And he looks at how the top academics at the time tried to justify the truth of the Bible. So you see these fantastic minds going, no, it's all correct because, rather than just saying the 6 days of creation were probably a bit longer than a day in our terms, and who cares about how long ago it happened? It's not really relevant to how we ought to behave, and our belief systems should be focused on that, how we ought to behave, how it's best to behave, and that it's best to be compassionate in this world, and it's best to have humility, rather than, you know, the pompous nonsense that was trotted out to try and, you know, and it all got much worse, of course, when Wallace and Darwin came along and threw their hats into the ring. But that, of course, didn't stop Wallace from being a spiritualist. You know, well, Darwin said he was an agnostic, a word invented by his disciple Thomas Huxley, meaning not knowing that you could not know how the universe began. Pretty much, you know, the first cause was unknowable.
Darwin was known as saying, you know, as to intelligent design, he preferred to wave a white flag as opposed to fight it, you know, because he had no way of knowing whether that was true or not. But he knew from his evidence that it seems like nature was going through this process that he, you know, that he tried to describe in his theory, and it still holds up. I mean, evolutionary theory is very useful.
Yeah, it's been developed a heck of a lot further.
Oh, yeah, and especially with our DNA research now, it's incredible how it holds up.
But the thing is that it's beginning to break down as well. The first significant development after Darwin is Mendel, who of course is an abbot. He's a member of the Catholic Church. So this ridiculous idea that science and religion have been fighting this war. That we now have epigenetics. We also have cultural and symbolic effects upon evolution. And we now know that evolution is happening at every moment. It's not a process that takes tens of thousands or millions of years. It's happening all the time. What if I smoke cigarettes, that can have an effect upon my genes, which can be passed on epigenetically to my children and grandchildren. So it's actually a more complex and wonderful world, but natural selection through random mutation is still a vital step along the way towards that understanding.
Yeah. I think the message here is that it has a certain beauty to it, a certain elegance to it that holds up, even though it's not perfect.
Yeah.
You know, whereas the fundamentalist view, the literalist view, that God somehow with his magic wand popped up the universe, you know, in 6 sort of days, whatever you want to call them, I think even the original writers of that saw it as symbolic.
And there are two versions. There are two versions of it in Genesis.
There were actually 2 different cultures. It wasn't 2 versions. It was 2 cultures that they're representing from the Canaanite tribes from which the ancient Israelites came from. There were 2 foundation myths as to creation.
Well, you have Judea and Israel as well. You have the division of the kingdom.
Yeah.
But you have, exactly. There are 2 versions of Genesis which are pushed together.
And then
probably under Ezra and
blended the Yahwist tradition with the Elohist tradition.
Yeah.
In ancient Judaism, and so you know, it's not a simple foundation. It's much more complex
and fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. That you know, what are we being told? Is it a history? No, it isn't. In one story, Adam is there naming things as they are created, and in the other, he's the last created thing, save for the spare rib that was used for other purposes.
And that rib thing still mystifies a lot of people. You know, where did that come from?
Yeah, and why isn't there an odd number of ribs on the other side? And that's what I don't get.
Well,
did Adam have a belly button?
Well, that's the other one. Yeah. So
chickens.
We could go on and on with this stuff. I don't have.
We probably will, but not now.
Not now. So maybe we could wrap this up with something. Any ideas?
Well, I think that this notion of having a hero that for me, I think, you know, I believed in enlightenment for nearly 40 years. So it sustained me through Scientology and long after. And then one day I kind of went, I don't care. I don't want that thing. What I want is to be human and to have the best possible relationships with people around me. And I don't seek to be a hero beyond the point, you know, Joseph Campbell, again, keeps cropping up here, said, you know, if you've been born, then you're a hero. Right. You know, you've survived that first thing, the first travails, the first great adventure by coming out alive and kicking. And I think that is true, that, you know, and I wouldn't go for his kind of Hollywood hero journey thing. I don't think you can compress everything into that story. And I think there are elements of it that I disagree with. But we'll talk about that another time. But the idea of the hero, the idea of having somebody outside of yourself who represents everything that's good, we need to be very careful in choosing our heroes. And the journey is the journey for you to become, you know, I think David Copperfield, I don't remember the exact words, but it remains to be seen if I should be the hero of my own life. And I think it is becoming the hero, becoming the leader of your own personal one-person cult, if you like, where you, and it's, you and I, we spent our lives considering this, reading all sorts of things to try and get a handle on it. And for both of us, a lot of it has been, you know, many years of trying to help other people who've been hurt by their involvement with guru systems where the heroes proved to be tyrants, proved to be martinets.
And I think this, to finish this up, and you and I both have been involved in the arts, and telling me you're getting more involved back into it
gradually.
You know, and I have an active studio. I produce paintings as often as I can, but you know, I go back to Becker and Rank again, where if the hero system, the collective isn't working or isn't, it breaks down. You know, and this happens when people go into psychotherapy, for instance. They get stripped down. You know, who are you really? What are you trying to get to? Why are you holding on to these things, you know, that are holding you back? And then you come down to this essential self. And now you got to build up, who am I? You got to believe in your own hero system.
Yep.
And this can work two ways. You can maintain that and be part of the collective in a way. So, you know, sometimes you merge yourself into the collective, like when you go to a religious service, and then when you leave it, you go back to being a father, a mother, a creative artist, or whatever it is. Or you can invest it completely in the art world, like Vincent van Gogh did, and that becomes your hero system. You reflect it in yourself, and you drive it to the very end. You know, as that song "Take It to the Limit One More Time" says, and that song appeals to the artist. You know, because they take each piece to the limit one more time.
It's true.
So that's another way to approach this problem of the repression of death, the terror of death, and having a heroic way of approaching it. This is what Becker's after. So you can do it through the collective, which is fine if the collective is healthy. You know, and you don't get caught up in a bad cult or one particular political party that's going off the rails for some reason, you know, but and if you don't get so obsessed with your own creation that you lie about it like Hubbard did, you know. So and to some extent David Neal did a little bit, but a lot of what she did was true also. So it's a mix, but the point is that she was one of those people that created her own hero system, adopting the hero system of Buddhism. She didn't merge herself into it. Because she was sort of her own guru at the end. You know, she didn't submit to any other teacher toward the end of her life. And so in a sense, maybe she lived out the hero in a very flawed way, but at the same time in a very enriching way, because her books are very enriching, right? And so maybe I could leave it at that's the human struggle, is to try to get it as aesthetically pleasing as you can, so that other people can share in it. and meaning your own creation, your own hero system. And if you're part of a collective, at least get into one that's aesthetically pleasing, that shares its beauty and its goodness with people in an equitable way. And we've seen religions do that at times.
Very much so. I mean, the tremendous moves forward, Wilberforce and the Clapham sect and slavery in England, for example, that was a fight worth taking on. And definitely in much of the reform in Britain, the Chartist movement, bringing votes to everybody, it actually comes out of the Anglican and Methodist churches, so that they can be great forces for good. There's something in Campbell's system, and it's many years since I read Campbell, but I read a lot of it. And in the Masks of God, you have primitive mythology, Oriental mythology, Occidental or Western mythology, and the final 500-page book is creative mythology. This side, so he says you have a shamanistic system where people have these visionary experiences, and they are the medicine men and the war leaders, of course, among the Plains Indians as well, people like Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull. But they have this direct access. Then you have priesthoods where they have a book of rules that tells them what to do. And he believes that the evolution from there is into creativity, that putting aside, all of these myths, actually developing your own interpretation of the myth. And so he looks to Thomas Mann, who was a profoundly flawed human being, to James Joyce, who was a profoundly flawed human being, to Pablo Picasso, who was a profoundly flawed human being. But they used creativity and made something transcendent of it, something that goes beyond the mundane everyday work.
But I think they were also keen on their relationship with the public and how to cultivate that. Picasso was very good at it. And
brilliant.
So was Alexander David Neal, so was Matisse. Van Gogh was not very good at it.
No, but the weird thing is that
Van Gogh, history took over, right?
But the week he killed himself, or as some say, a boy who'd stolen his gun shot him, there is that other view, but the week he killed himself, La Mercure de France, the most important artistic paper, actually had a feature article on him. Yeah. So he seemed to respond, and he just sold the Red Vineyard. He sold one painting finally. It was just about to begin. And maybe he couldn't take that. And certainly he was drinking too much absinthe, judging by the accounts that he submitted to his brother Ted.
That and I've read all kinds of speculative diagnoses about him, but he is obviously a very troubled man, and perhaps manic at times, and had bouts of psychosis. And it could have been through the absinthe, it could have been through other, maybe lead in his paint. I don't know. It could have been anything that might have built up in his system, but there was a reason for him to be in an asylum toward the end. And
absolutely. And the sympathetic treatment that Dr. Gachet gave to him was remarkable. It always interests me that people tell a story of him cutting his right earlobe off, not his right ear, and gifting it to a prostitute, as one would if one had done that probably. Here's a bit of me for you. That the part of the story that never seems to be emphasized is that the reason he did it was that he was trying to murder Gauguin.
Yes, well, he had a dispute. Yeah.
Nobody's got any sympathy for Paul Gauguin.
Well, I think anybody, those two characters, just their personalities, was like a lightning storm together, So the outsized Gauguin and this manic, intense Van Gogh that didn't like to bathe, So it was quite a. I mean, I think we love these characters in looking back because of that.
Yes, to some extent, and because they both produced unbelievable works of art.
Yes, or at least we come to an agreement in art history that these are unbelievable works. They weren't just discarded. Now, we continue to discover people that were not discovered until they, 100 years after they died. We have, the market is always looking for the next new thing to celebrate, to create a new hero, because there's money in it, right? So you have to look at that part of this whole game of hero systems as well.
It's true.
The investment in it, and the fact that museums need to keep up the image, the quality of the image of their collection. Van Gogh, you can't have a historian demeaning Van Gogh and the value of his work, because it could diminish a $50 million painting into a $10 million painting.
Yeah.
This is part of the game.
And there's an interesting aside there, which is that the first painting to be sold for $50 million, the Sunflowers, which is in a Japanese bank, I believe, that there are people, and I am among them, who believe it's actually a pastiche painted by Dr. Gachet, and that Van Gogh had taught him how to paint. That was how he paid his bill. So he used the peculiar encaustic oil method, mixing cold wax with oil to make it thick. He used exactly the colors. He used the right canvas. So everything is right about the picture, except it doesn't look like a Van Gogh when you compare it. So even there, it persists. And as you say, there are artists, Vermeer and the whole set of Georges de la Tour were discovered. Vermeer was not considered a major painter until sometime after his life. William Blake was not considered important until sometime after death.
No, he was derided as a little bit, nutty, and well, he was eccentric. Blake was very eccentric.
He certainly was a little bit eccentric.
And he was cranky. I mean, he got into trouble in the courts at times. He had that odd wife that was not educated, and adored him, and he liked having that around, I guess.
And the chambermaid, apparently, just as Karl Marx liked the chambermaid.
Yeah. So, I did a honors course paper on Blake in college, so I have some idea who William Blake was back in the 60s, and he just fascinated with me, and I've gone up and down in my admiration for him over the years. But I even went to Washington, D.C., to the General Library that had the original prints of Blake's Books of Innocence, and I looked at the original prints there, with white gloves on.
Yeah, which he, of course, engraved himself.
Yes, these were done by himself. These were one of the originals, and so I went that far to try to touch Blake, but yeah, I still find him interesting. I know that one of my professors in college, she was from India, and she was a Blake master of sorts, and she told me that he was really a proto-psychologist, that he was breaking the human being into these facets of internal selves, and we began to catch up with Blake in a way when we started looking at the self as different aspects: the hero self, the orderly self, the Dionysian self, all of these things we have within us. Blake kind of exploded all that into his weird mystical poetry, like Jerusalem, lost the great creative force, banging on his anvil, and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's a whole other story.
He does exemplify what we're talking about. That he's a creative artist who, whether he was right or wrong, developed his own system. As far as I understand it, he's the first person to criticize the Industrial Revolution. The Dark Satanic Mills is written.
Yes, he did. And also racism. He criticized that.
Yeah. So, he became his own guru, and in places he's a little bit odd. But what's the harlot's cry from street to street shall be old England's winding sheet. Let's leave that thought with our viewers, and what a great pleasure it is talking with you, Joe. It really is.
Very good. Well, it was fun. Well, maybe we'll do it again down the line. But thanks for doing this series. I'm enjoying watching what I have seen so far. So
great. Well, I'm Jon Atack. This is Joe Szimhart. Go out and rush out and buy his book, as I've said already. And we'll switch off the recording now and have a short conversation beyond that, which will be secret, and nobody here will see it.
You have to have hidden things.
Absolutely, the mysteries. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.